Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, scientists, writers, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. I'm pleased to welcome Mary Brosnahan, a social scientist with a laboratory we see all around us, on street corners, subways, train stations, and those waiting at soup kitchens. They are the families and the single young and old, displaced for many reasons. But the end result is the same. They have no place to call home. Mary Brosnahan is the executive director of the Coalition for the Homeless, and the homeless could have no fiercer or devoted advocate. Welcome.
Thanks, Sheryl.
Mary, it was just announced this week that Robert Hess, the commissioner of the city's Department of Homeless Services, is resigning to be replaced by Seth Diamond, who is, I believe, of the Human Resources Administration. Is this a good change or not? How do you feel about that?
Well, we're a bit concerned. Seth Diamond has been at HRA for quite a while, and under Jason Turner, during the Giuliani administration, was one of the main people crafting some of the most punitive welfare policies that the nation saw. As you remember, a tremendous amount of front-end deterrence and also churning of people off the welfare rolls. And even some of the comments made not only by Mr. Diamond, but Deputy Mayor Gibbs, with this changeover that, you know, this is an end to a free handout and so on, doesn't engender the feeling that they really are concerned about these record number of families with small children.
Right. Now, you have been through 3 mayoral administrations, Dinkins, Rudolph Giuliani, and Mayor Bloomberg. What has it been like? I mean, how does the current administration's approach to the homeless and sympathy for the situation of the homeless compare to Giuliani's or Dave Dinkins?
Well, you know, when Bloomberg first came in, we all breathed a sigh of relief. You remember during the Giuliani era, it was quite contentious. I mean, he would go on the radio and say, tomorrow we're going to start arresting all homeless people, and make sort of crazy statements like that. At the same time, he was in court trying to undo the right to shelter, which the coalition had won back in the early 80s, which is unique in New York. If you are in need of a shelter bed, you, by consent decree now, are provided that accommodation. And so the early months of the Bloomberg administration were quite promising. They rallied a lot of the Section 8 vouchers and tried to move the families out of the system. But around 2005, we saw a real change in policy where the Bloomberg administration denied this type of priority for homeless families for Section 8. And the result is that the numbers have skyrocketed. Just to give you an idea of magnitude, we have over 10,000 families in the municipal shelter system. That includes 16,000 kids. That's an all-time high. And so, you know, if you sort of look at the investments that Mayor Koch and Mayor Dinkins made to build housing and fund housing for homeless people, Giuliani was able to sort of ride the coattails of that, but since we don't have that investment and we don't have that prioritization for homeless families, what we've seen is that the numbers have gone through the roof.
39,000 in the shelter system?
Just in the shelter system.
As of January.
Right.
Now, is this due to a recent upsurge because of what's happened to the economy, or was it, or had it been going up steadily? What's caused that?
Well, again, that's why I draw people's attention back to 2005 with this policy change, because that's when you start to see a real jump. Long before the current economic debacle, we started seeing increased numbers of families in the shelter system. So if you look at the system as a system, you can look at the numbers coming in, and admittedly, we have record numbers coming in. For instance, in 2008, we had about 1,200 families a month coming in. Now we have closer to 1,500 families a month coming in. So certainly, most recently, we see this flood of families coming in. But what you also have to look at is how are families exiting the system? And without that Section 8 long-term support, you don't have families not only exiting the system, but not coming back in. So it's not that complicated. You have the front end and the back end.
Right, but the numbers of homeless had gone down in the 80s, correct?
Absolutely.
I remember, like the late 80s, the early 80s, you saw homeless people everywhere.
Right.
In the wintertime, there were just rows of people sleeping on the floor of Penn Station and Port Authority and probably Grand Central. They were sleeping on the steps of churches. They were living under bridges
Right.
and in tunnels. Then I know I left the city. I came back in '87, and you didn't see them anymore. They were gone somewhere.
Right.
Where did they go?
Well, there were a few things at play. First of all, when you got into the Giuliani years, there was aggressive policing, so that certainly during daylight hours, people were pushed out of sight. But you also saw the real tangible results of these investments that I spoke about. You know, Ed Koch, I think one of his lasting legacies is the billions of dollars that he put into building hundreds of thousands of units of housing for extremely low-income people.
Basically converting a lot of in-rem housing that people
Exactly.
hadn't paid, that the city took over because people hadn't paid taxes.
Right. But another dynamic here, and it's very interesting that you bring up that you're not seeing as many people, certainly as those days in the 80s, is that the proportions have changed significantly. Now when you look at this number, the 39,000 number, only about 8,000 of that is the single adults, and the vast majority are these mothers with small children. And so again, since we have this right to shelter, unlike San Francisco and some other major cities, you're not seeing entire families sleeping in cars, but we still do have that tremendous dislocation and all the associated devastation that happens to a child's life when they become homeless.
Now, how do you feel about Mayor Bloomberg's use of the Section 8 vouchers to provide housing for the homeless? I think I read that he allocated 6,000 vouchers for the homeless this year, up from 2,700 last year. But I also thought I had heard that the federal government had withdrawn funding from the vouchers. There were no vouchers.
Yeah, that's a little complicated situation in that, again, in 2005, the mayor stopped giving priority to homeless families, so the actual number of homeless families receiving Section 8 actually had gone down tremendously. But at the same time, there's a tremendous confusion and mismanagement in NYCHA, where they actually extended 3,000 vouchers, gave family vouchers, and told them that, you know, to go ahead and move. And then back in December said, oh, we don't have the money to fund those vouchers, sort of snatching it back. And now most recently, they're in such economic straits, they're talking about taking away vouchers from 10,000 families that are already in housing. So, you know. Now
vouchers, aren't they paid for by the federal government?
They are indeed. And so what you're seeing across the country is that because the times are so tough, there's less turnover with the vouchers. In other words, families are using the vouchers and staying in Section 8 housing longer, and so they don't have the vouchers being returned.
Right.
So it's fewer vouchers being freed up for newly homeless families.
How is the city's homeless shelter program working under Bloomberg?
Well, again, going back to the first Bloomberg term, they instituted something called a Work Advantage program, and it was a sale on every front because essentially people were told that you had to have an open welfare case in order to qualify, so it was a real disincentive for people to get jobs. Now they have a series of new programs called Work Advantage, Fixed Income Advantage, and Child Advantage. And the problem with these programs is that they're a 2-year time-limited program. And so what we're seeing now is that families who are graduating off those programs are coming back into the shelter system. So initially you have a mother with small children, she's working, she's getting her life back together. And so she gets this voucher, she's thrilled, but doesn't realize that 2 years is a very quick time. And so when that voucher runs out, if you just do the math, if
she can't afford
exactly, if she's in an apartment that costs about $1,100 a month and is only making $1,200 a month, without that rental subsidy, it's impossible to make it.
So is that still the case? Is it still the case that you can get a voucher, but it's only good for 2 years and you lose it?
It is, and what's most troubling is that the City Council held hearings, I think about 10 days ago, where now the city wants to even cut back on the value of those vouchers. So for the first year, the person would pay a third of their income for rent, which is what you do under Section 8, which is a great sort of formula. But that the second year, you have to pay either 50% of the rent of the apartment or 30% of your income, whichever is greater. And so now we're even talking about sort of turning up the treadmill faster, where you don't even have that 30% cushion for 2 years.
Why would the council want to do that? I mean, if this...
Well, the council was holding hearings asking that question to the administration. Why would you want to do that?
Because it's federal money.
Well, no, this is the city program. I'm saying
see.
Since we don't have Section 8 now, they've put forth this city program, which is 2-year, time limited. So the council was asking the question to the administration, especially given the desperate economic conditions and the actual income that these people are making, why would you want to cut back so starkly?
There was a time when families were sleeping on the floors and chairs of the intake centers. And that was, I think, the subject of litigation, perhaps by you people. Is this still going on? And if it isn't, where do they go?
Well, what's happened now is we don't have the old EAU where people were sleeping on the floors, and we're grateful for that. There's a new intake center in the Bronx. It's called the PATH Center. But the flash point up there now is that the city has made it increasingly difficult for families to access. So it prohibited any overnight accommodations there, but at the same time, families are made to prove their homelessness without any help from the city. In other words, homelessness is not sort of a straight line for most families. You lose your apartment, a lot of times you'll stay with a relative. And so the first order business at the PATH Center is you fill out a 2-year housing history, and then there's an investigation. And so at every turn, the city's telling the family, well, you have a place to go back to, you have a place. And it's up to the mother with the children to go and get notarized letters from landlords, all types of documentation proving that they really have no place else to go. And so during that time, that investigatory time for weeks, a lot of times the families are given one-night placements, often in different areas. And what I see time and again is the impact on the children, because you're given a placement here one night, you have to pack up all your belongings, and at the same time the child is many times, mostly traveling for hours on end just to get to school the next morning.
Where are they going? Are they going to hotels? Are they going to...
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
And the controller released a report last month about how prevalent the use is of these non-contracted hotels. The mayor had promised to get out of the business of these handshake deals, when in fact it continues, and a lot of terrible conditions now are continuing to be paid for top dollar with taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back right after this message.
Weight loss, it's one of the many ways to fight osteoarthritis pain. For more information on managing pain, go to fightarthritispain.org.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking to Mary Brosnahan, Executive Director of the Coalition for the Homeless. Who gets to stay in a city shelter? Who gets into it?
Well, you have to meet the needs test for public assistance. So in essence, the people that are staying in a public shelter system are desperately poor and also have no place else to stay. That's the bottom line.
And the average stay is 11 months?
The average stay was 11 months, but interestingly, that's come down slightly. And when you talk to the shelter providers, what they're seeing again is that the way that their contracts with the city have been structured is it's incentivized now to get the families out as quickly as possible through these shallow subsidy programs. What came out in the city council hearing recently was that over the next 12 months, we expect 6,000 families to graduate off that shallow subsidy program. So again, providers now are seeing families returning to the system because they don't have the long-term assistance they need.
So your family that's in a shelter, say you're there for like 9 months, where do you go when you leave?
Well, you're going into private housing by and large. Again, not only did the city cut off the prioritization for Section 8, but also for NYCHA. NYCHA is a tremendous resource that the city could be marshaling under these conditions and could be placing families so that they would be actually stabilized. So you wind up in the private market trying to work with the landlord who will take this advantage voucher.
So does everybody who's moved out of shelter, they find housing for them, permanent or semi-permanent?
Well, some of the families just disappear, and we don't know what happens to them. And so what we do know through work that's been done long-term, sort of looking at where those are the families that are most likely to wind up back in the system. I should be clear, we're talking about the families at this point because it's the majority. For the single adults, there are supportive units for people who have special needs, such as mental illness or substance abuse histories. And one of the great things that happened a couple weeks ago is that we joined forces with Public Advocate Bill de Blasio, Speaker Chris Quinn, and DHS to formulate a new plan where the city would stop putting these frail single adults into these illegal boarding houses. It wasn't just us, but many people, including the fire department, were outraged by some of the conditions that they found these frail people in.
Are there really apartments in the housing projects for a significant number of homeless people? Because my sense was that the vacancy rate in the
NYCHA
projects was fairly low.
It is low, but it's such a vast system, there still is a reservoir there. So we're not saying that NYCHA is the solution, but certainly given this crisis that is unprecedented, the city could be marshaling, especially for the families that have special needs. You know, one of the things that I've seen increasingly are moms that have children, for instance, with cerebral palsy or acute asthma, these type of conditions where they really need a place that they can go to where they can have the space, for instance, to have physical therapy or not have a smoker in the unit. And so, again, looking at that valuable resource, it isn't an end-all and be-all, but certainly it's something that the city could be looking at to ease the pressure.
What do you think of the mayor's proposal to make shelter residents who are working pay rent?
Well,
is that happening, or is he still just talking about it?
Well, this actually is very interesting. It goes back to 1995 when Giuliani convinced George Pataki to put a state regulation that would permit the localities to do this. Now all of a sudden, and this is another thing that raises our eyebrows with Seth Diamond coming in, that what they're proposing is for a family that's making $25,000 that they would pay over $900 a month in rent for shelter. And it begs the question, geez, given how extremely expensive shelter is, $36,000, $38,000 now for a family, wouldn't you want that mother to save that money to get up and out of the system rather than just simply take it away and prolong her homelessness? So we're working with tremendous leaders up in Albany, State Senator Squadron and also Keith Wright in the Assembly, who are pushing to actually on a state level block this. This could be a very damaging program and also a complete disincentive for people to work.
What do you think is the biggest flaw of the shelter system, and what do you think is the biggest strength of the shelter system?
Well, the biggest strength is clear. It saves lives. You know, and this was the original vision when Coalition brought litigation back in 1981. We saw people dying on our streets. And so it's meant to be an emergency system where people can come in and get the help they need. I think the biggest flaw now is that in an effort to just simply move people out, we've lost sight of, one, how do we stabilize the lives of these young children at the front end of the system, but also what's happening to people when they're being forced off these shallow-term subsidy programs. You know, you don't want to just create a revolving door where families are just going to come in again at the end of 2 years. It's not only tremendously disruptive to the children's lives, but also for the taxpayers footing the bill. You know, we're at $39,000 now. I would hate in a few years to be looking at, what, $45,000, even more?
So what's the role of the coalition in all of this?
Well, the role of the coalition is twofold. We are frontline advocates. We use litigation as a last resort, but we do a lot of public education and work with our elected leaders to present cost-effective long-term solutions. But we also help 3,500 people every day on the front lines. Our offices are down on the corner of Fulton and Nassau Street, and it's one of the few places in the city where you can come without an appointment and see one of our crisis counselors. And it runs the gamut from I can't get into the shelter system to mothers who need formula and diapers for their babies, etc. We have a terrific job training program for homeless women called First Step that gives them computer training and actual job experience and placements. We feed 1,000 people every night on the street, hot meals, and we use that as a conduit to get people into our office to give them long-term help. We have lots of permanent housing programs, and what's coming up now is we have a great sleepaway camp up in Bear Mountain for homeless children every summer. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, we
How,
have.
how long do they go away for?
They go away for 16 days. So we, all throughout the summer, we take 300 kids up. So it's 100 per session, boys and girls age 6 to about 13. Older than that we have, but they're counselors in training. And it's on a beautiful lakefront in Harriman State Park. And you can just see the transformation. You know, kids show up oftentimes crying because they're scared, and then they cry when they leave because they don't want to leave. It's like the first time that they've been allowed just to let their shoulders down and be kids.
And you have also created, you operate a scattered site housing program?
For people with AIDS, exactly.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's permanent housing and support services for people with AIDS.
Where does the money for your
Operation
come from?
We pride ourselves in that most of our money is private money, privately raised, and I think that's why we can be such honest and vocal advocates. We do have some city money, for instance, to house these people who have AIDS. We get some government money, for instance, FEMA money to feed people on the street, but by and large the money comes from small donations from people in the tri-state area.
You say the main cause of homelessness in New York City is the lack of affordable housing. Is anybody creating any?
Well, the mayor has a very ambitious housing program, 165,000 units to be either renovated or built. And in speaking with Sean Donovan before he departed for Washington, our plea was, you know, can we not have more of these units? Scarcely any of them are skewed towards extremely low-income people. They're mostly for moderate and middle income. And, you know, I love Sean Donovan because he's not an ideologue, and his point was we just need the long-term subsidy. If you have people with so little income, we need a way to subsidize that housing so it doesn't fall apart in the long term. So certainly, if we could redirect some of those units that the Bloomberg administration is investing in, that would be a tremendous help for the homeless population.
How does, well, certainly nobody is building any low-income housing. You know, there haven't been any housing projects built in I don't know when or anything like it since that I know of. And in a city that's becoming increasingly out of reach for middle-class people, not to mention for poor people, how do you, I mean, is it practical that any really low-income housing would be built, or do you have to think primarily in terms, as you said, about subsidies?
Well, think about subsidies, but also understand that the reason why we're losing so many of the very low-income units is through rent destabilization. In other words, when people move out, the landlord does renovations, and then the apartment no longer falls under the rent stabilization rules, and we're hemorrhaging thousands and thousands of units every year. Certainly the city could redouble its efforts. I have to say, when you asked before, is anybody building low-income housing, there still are nonprofits out there that are trying to build low-income housing, but we need much more of that investment because it's really the nonprofit groups that are able to put all those complex pieces together so that very low-income people have a place to call home permanently.
Is there any large city that you know of that has an exemplary record of dealing with the homeless that New York City ought to be imitating?
I think, you know, one of the things that's so ironic about the current situation is New York is the model. If you go back to the 80s, New York pioneered all these great modalities, including actually more recently a housing first approach where you can take severely mentally ill people off the street and put them directly in housing, completely bypassing the shelter system, which for many reasons mentally ill people don't want to go into that system. And so we have all the technology here. I would say New York is the model. Let's just go back to what we know works and has worked beautifully in the past.
Are you hopeful, or do you sometimes wish you were doing it something else for a living?
Dog walker. I am hopeful. I think that the thing that energizes me so much is New York is such a smart city, and people have a sophistication about this stuff, and they have a memory. And for instance, just this recent nonsense about charging rent in the shelters, huge outcry where people are like, this is literally crazy. And so I love working here because when you focus on what works, people really get behind it.
So if you had a wish list of 1 or 2 or 3 things, what would they be?
I would say let's start with reprioritizing. The Section 8 spigot, so to speak, will turn on eventually.
Reprioritize them for the homeless.
Right. Doing that, redoubling our efforts to invest in that housing for for mentally ill people. And then also at the end of the day, let's stop criminalizing the people that are left on the street. They're there for a reason, and we can do better by them.
Are we doing that? Are we arresting homeless people?
Well, I think that we're making it increasingly difficult for people just to survive and get from one day to the next. This is what we're seeing on our feeding program every night. And it varies from precinct to precinct. You'll find sort of wild swings in sort of what is tolerated by police in terms of just existing on the streets. And so it's an area that's not looked at often, but I think that Ray Kelly is a really smart police commissioner, and with his help, maybe we could bring some sanity to this sort of checkerboard approach that we have currently.
It's a tough problem.
It is.
Yeah. It's probably the toughest in all of New York City. We're out of time, and I want to thank Mary Brosnahan, Executive Director of the Coalition for the Homeless, for joining me today. If you'd like more information on how you can help, you can go to the Coalition's website at coalitionforthehomeless.org. For the City University of New York and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.